Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, the author of The Westerners, Mythmaking and Belonging on the American Frontier. This is her fifth book. She is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, is a fellow at the Society of American Historians, is quoted in every credible documentary about the American West, has written 1 million pieces for major papers, and is also a seasoned professor. Do you ever look back and wonder, when did you do all that?
I do, sort of. But thanks for having me back on the show. It's great to see you and talk to you again.
We're so happy to have you. You were on episode 44 in August of 2021 to talk about your book, The Three-Cornered War. You were on episode 76 in February of 2022 to talk about saving Yellowstone. Doctor, it's great to have you back. How does book 5 feel in comparison to your other ones? Do you compare? Is it natural to compare them to each other?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like The Westerners, I mean, it's such a bigger book in many ways, chronologically, geographically, than at least the previous two, the sort of two other books that I see it in conversation with, and sort of as a kind of a family member. I took a photo of all three covers and posted it, and I was like, here's the family photo. Because they all do that, they're all Scribner books and they're all designed by the same art department. So they do look alike, they are definitely related. But Three Cornered was 7 years really focused on New Mexico and the Civil War, and then Saving Yellowstone, of course, focused on that amazing landscape that became a national park. But that book really only spanned a year and a half. So to tackle the entire 19th century in the Westerners was a different kind of challenge because I was really interweaving the stories of these 7 really remarkable people who were moving through the West and building lives for themselves in the 19th century. And then just an incredible amount of historical context for a century that saw just incredible change. I mean, every century does, but it really felt like from Lewis and Clark to the World's Fair of 1893, just huge differences in the way that people lived and how many people were living from coast to coast and in the American West itself. So the scope of it was pretty challenging, but also really fun.
Yeah. Before we get into the beef of it here, I want to just make 2 notes. One is I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And also, AxelbankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work. All right, the topic. As I started thinking about this, I realized that the West is kind of a funny place. Here in Florida, people say that I live on the West Coast because I live in Tampa.
Right.
The National League West in baseball once featured the Atlanta Braves. There's there there's a Western New York, but not an Eastern New York. No one says I'm from Eastern New York unless you're talking about Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
West of the Mississippi was once really far west, but now nobody in a practical sense would say that west of the Mississippi means you're in the West necessarily. When I lived on the West Coast while I was in college, that's the real West Coast, California, my
Mm-hmm.
parents would call and I'd be like, hey, I'm still in bed. It's 10 a.m. I'm in college. What are you bothering me for? They'd be like, what are you talking about? It's the middle of the afternoon. What's happening out there? And then I found this quote in your book. Excuse me. The frontier was geographically the border between nations, or the raw, unrefined edge of human civilization, where countries sent armies to guard against their enemies. They're the furthermost limit of human understanding. That's from your book. My first
Mm-hmm.
question, Doctor, is here in America, where does the East end and the West begin?
I mean, that's a big dispute. I think you could talk to anyone who lives in the West, and they might all have a different idea about where that line is. I used to, when I taught college courses on the American West, I would show these just a range of different maps. One of them was a rainfall map. So we have an environmental definition of where the West begins and ends, which is really the Sierra Nevadas and then extending all the way to the 100th meridian. And that's a matter of rainfall. So the West is defined there as high and dry, right?
Mm.
You've got fewer than 20 inches of rainfall a year,
So the
which
West is like a
means
weather thing in some ways.
it's a weather thing, it's a geographic thing, it's a hydrological thing. I mean, I usually say you know the West when you feel it, because you do feel that high and dry impact on your body, which means that parts of California would not be considered the West, while
Mm.
some would be. The Pacific Northwest, I think, is its own region. The Russians used to call it, back in the 18th century, the rain coast. Um, so it has abundant rain as opposed to the rest of the West, which does not. And if you look on a topographical map, the West is very apparent, right? It is usually colored in kind of brown and has all of the wrinkles of massive, massive mountain ranges, the Sierras and the Rockies in particular. But then there was another map, which you will find delightful, which was about football fandom. So you were in the West if you were a Broncos fan.
Ah. Mm.
This may have changed with expansion, but
And Denver's kind of in the middle, like there's
Denver's
like
right,
tons
the
of room
epicenter.
around it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Till you
And
get to the next
so,
team.
yeah, exactly. And so there are lots of different ways to define it, but I think you do, for me, I'm a landscape environmental historian in part, and so that really appeals to me. I grew up in the West, and even though I left when I was 18 and have mostly lived in the East Coast, I've lived in Boston for longer than I lived in Colorado. Um, I still think of myself as a Westerner. And when I fly back to any of those states in the Intermountain West, my body kind of feels the the kind of
The
relationship
home.
to home.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
home.
yeah,
Yeah.
it feels
Yeah.
more comfortable. I'm like, okay, I can, it takes me about a day to adjust, but the elevation doesn't really bother me. I love the aridity. My hair looks great. I mean, the all of that is just part of what makes you feel like this is your home place.
At what point do the people who founded America, that early generation, when did they become curious, and maybe they were all
Mm.
along, as to what was beyond the Western frontier, which at that point was like Pennsylvania and Virginia?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think they always were curious, but when we think about the 17th and 18th century from a European colonial standpoint, France is there, Spain is there, England is there, and they are all establishing communities. I mean, the Spanish are in Florida, right? Earlier than anybody else. And um, they're all building towns and outposts, and the Mississippi River becomes a very important part of that. And New Orleans, in particular, becomes a very important city on the North American continent. And so, really, you start to see from Americans an interest pretty soon after the Revolution, actually. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is interested for many reasons. One, because he's a natural scientist. So he's kind of always intellectually curious about what is there in North America. And he makes several arguments in the notes on the state of Virginia that there's so much unique topography and unique animal life and plant life in North America that it is distinctive from and also could be older than Europe, right? And he's making that argument. And this is part of the reason for sending Lewis and Clark out to investigate the Mississippi River and then the Missouri and to try and find some kind of path to the Pacific. And what I find so interesting, which I had not known before I did the research for this book, we think we know all these things about major American events like the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition, but he had asked Congress for money to fund the Lewis and Clark expedition before he even knew that he was going to get Louisiana. I mean, he was paranoid about the English and the French and the Spanish in that region. He wanted to buy New Orleans only. And then Napoleon, of course, came back and was like, "Hey, you want the whole thing, the whole shebang for 15 million?" And he was like, "Why not?" But Lewis and Clark were in St. Louis.
Do you want the whole thing?
Uh,
We really will give you pretty
we'll
much the whole thing. Yeah.
yeah. Not consulting any of the tribal nations who live there, who are like, "What are you talking about? These are our lands. We don't care about your papers and what they say." But Lewis and Clark were in St. Louis for that handover, which is kind of wild to think about. And he really he sent them through part of Louisiana territory, but mostly outside of it. Like they crossed that border almost immediately. So I think that was the beginning of a real interest in this particular region between the Pacific and the Missouri River. What kind of lay between those borders and how Americans could use it to succeed.
I want to ask about Sacajawea, but I think before we do, we have to talk about when the pioneer myth and how the pioneer
Right.
myth gets started. Who starts it? How does it sort of spring up? And was there a deliberate purpose behind it?
Right. So this is one of the arguments in the book is that this myth, the pioneer myth, the frontier myth, and its components, I think will be familiar to everyone listening to this podcast because it is so compelling and so pervasive. Um, this is the basic idea that white Americans, usually mostly from the Northeast, but also maybe from the Mid-Atlantic, moved west in a kind of almost a straight line. Many of them, especially later in the 19th century, in Conestoga wagons. And as they moved west, they confronted a number of challenges, including indigenous resistance and the challenges that nature brings to you when you are trying to move through a space you don't know very well. They suffered, but they persevered. And ultimately, they settled and won the American West. And that this is a fundamental narrative about who Americans are and how they came to be, right? All the pioneers exemplify all of those character traits that Americans tend to really admire. So the argument the book is making is that this myth and this narrative really emerged earlier than we think. I think maybe the perception is
Yeah,
it
I
was a
feel like it's like a
post
gold rush type
Civil
thing.
War, yeah, or like
Yeah.
mid-century. But really, you can see elements of it in Jefferson's instructions to Lewis and Clark
Mm.
and his arguments to Congress for funding. He's like, we're going to ultimately, now that we have this land along the Mississippi and the Missouri, everyone's going out there. And this is going to be the land of farmers. This is going to be the agrarian republic. And Jefferson and most white Americans considered this to be their right? Like that
Yeah.
this was, even before the term manifest destiny was coined in 1845, people were still thinking about America in that way, that
This
white
is
Americans,
ordained.
yes,
This
ordained
is
by
our.
God. Yeah, like we have a right to the entire continent. So it really is beginning right around the turn of the 19th century, right around 1800.
This is coming out at a time where, meaning your book is coming out at a time where so many scholars have tried to become public facing, to
Hmm.
explore the millions of stories that have been papered over by the more neat versions of history, like what you're talking about here with the
Right.
pioneer myth. Sacagawea wasn't just a guide, you say. You say that she was integral. Explain
Hmm.
when and how you realized that instead of being 1A, she is the story.
Yeah, it was so fascinating to write about her because, I'll admit I was a little nervous in the beginning, right? She's such an iconic figure. She is likely the only protagonist of the seven in the book who readers will know before they start reading, right? She has become iconic. She's on the Golden Dollar. She's apparently going to be in the Garden of Heroes, which means that she appeals across a broad spectrum of political belief in this country at this moment. Um, but no one really knew about her in the 19th century, which I find fascinating. Like she kind of burst into the American imagination in the 1890s, and then more strongly as part of the women's rights and suffrage movement in the 20th century. And that's because, I mean, what I thought was so interesting is that I started her story when she was just a young girl because I wanted to. I mean, obviously, the Lewis and Clark expedition is a central feature of what we know about her life, but she lived a life before that year and a half, and she lived a life after that year and a half. And many of the things that she did on the expedition were, in fact, traditionally women's jobs and their work and their roles in an indigenous world. So, Lewis and Clark take her on because her Sacagawea's husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, tells them, well, she knows she is Shoshone. She was kidnapped from her family in the Three Forks region of Montana and then taken to the upper Missouri River Valley to the Knife River villages, which are in, the Dakotas, as we know them now. And but she knew Shoshone, and Lewis and Clark knew they didn't know much about where they were going or what they were going to do, but they did know that at a certain point, which was in western Montana, they were going to need to abandon their canoes and get horses and ride over the mountains. And they knew the mountains were there. They didn't know how extensive. So they knew they had to negotiate with the Shoshone for horses. So they hired her on as a translator. But reading through their journals, I mean, they talk about her a lot. She appears more than 150 times, doing things, saying things, which was great. And she was a botanist. She brought them a lot of samples that they then sent back to Jefferson and wrote about in their journals. As part of that, she was also kind of a dietitian. She knew root vegetables and things that they could integrate into their diet. And she may have, in fact, saved many of the members of the Corps of Discovery from getting scurvy and other diseases like that. She also at one point saved the papers and some of the scientific instruments when they got dumped overboard in a canoe.
Mm.
But she chose the winter campsite and lobbied for it and voted for it when they were near the Pacific coast, halfway through the expedition. And this is why women suffragists took her up, because they argued that she was the first woman to vote in America, because she voted on that site. So, but really, I argue in the book that she became an explorer in her own right, that she moved through this enormous landscape of the West and got to know it herself.
Yeah, I want to ask about that golden dollar. You mentioned that, and I want to start this question by just reading the first paragraph of the book, because I think this paragraph is why a lot of people would say, "Oh, I love books." It's like that generic line, right? Like, I love
Hmm.
books. The book that the way you introduce it, just beautiful sense of place. I want to just read this real quick. The water in the narrow river was rushing with spring snowmelt when a northern Shoshone woman knelt on the bank with her infant daughter in her arms. She bathed her in the river water just as the god Coyote had washed the Shoshone people after he created them. Wrapping her in deer skins, the woman introduced the baby to her father, a chief of the forgive me, Agai Dika. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
All right. All right.
that's
Well,
pretty
all right. There you
close.
go. We'll go with that.
Agatika. Yeah, yeah.
And her two brothers and older sister. They named her Sacajawea, which is a boat launcher. Beautiful writing. You've always created amazing senses of place in your writing. And what's interesting to me about that is I feel like I know her better after those 8 lines or 6 lines than I did um, despite having
Mhm.
at one time being kind of blown away by this new golden coin that came out in the United States. Looking back, was that I mean, we got the coin and she had kind of a name that you'd never heard before, and it was this new character introduced along with the other coin people, Washington, FDR, Jefferson, all these other, Lincoln, all these other coin people, I could say. Was that coin effective in opening our eyes to someone new?
Mhm.
Looking back.
Such an interesting question. I mean, it certainly kind of staked a claim for her, right, in this pantheon of Americans who changed the way that people thought about the nation, that changed the course of history. And it's such a complicated thing, though, right? Because she was Indigenous. She has been figured in many ways as merely a guide, a kind of vanishing, this is the term like the vanishing Indian of the 19th century who appears to help white explorers and hunters and to guide them on their way and to show them the future, not of the indigenous world, but of the American world, the world of the United States, and then disappears. And this is why I wanted to write about her before and after the Corps of Discovery, because at the time, the Corps of Discovery was just a kind of curiosity to indigenous peoples. They were like, what are these men doing just going out into the West and just to see what's there? And why are they here not to trade, but to give gifts? Like, we don't understand what they're doing. This makes no sense. And when they left, when they came back, when they returned and they left, no one really thought much more about them and how important that moment would be for Americans. So Sacajawea in the American context is kind of figured as the kind of helpful guide, but that's very controversial, right? How, and in the same way that Pocahontas is controversial, you have someone who's a cultural broker, someone who kind of eases tensions between indigenous people and European or American explorers and colonists. And is that person figured as a kind of traitor to their own people, and then a hero to the colonists and the invaders? And so she's a rather controversial figure, although several indigenous nations still today kind of are in conflict about claiming her as part of their communities, right? So everyone wants a piece of her. And I think it's because she did have this extraordinary experience and she spoke up for herself. She told her own story. She, decided she could have stayed with the Shoshone when Lewis and Clark moved through their territory. I mean, she could have just gone back to live with her family, and she did not. She chose to stay.
Are there sources that you can use to build a
Mhm.
biography of her that go beyond just the expedition?
This is the other kind of controversial thing is that there are indigenous sources, there are stories and histories passed down among the generations about her and about Charbonneau and about their life together and their descendants. But really, what we have is Lewis and Clark's journals and a
Mm.
couple of other records that Clark wrote and saved, and then several other people who were posted at or lived at garrisons or forts along the upper Missouri. And this is what creates enough kind of space and enough uncertainty that different people can claim her because we don't know. She did not produce her own record. We don't know what she may have felt like, except for comments that white men made about her, which is, I mean, it's controversial. And I understand it, but I also think that historians haven't really used the Lewis and Clark journals to the best effect. Because she does, whenever they talk about her, she is doing something or saying something. And that gave me the opportunity to really put you on the ground with her so that you would, I mean, I think maybe what you were responding to in that first paragraph of that chapter is that here she is a real person.
There's depth all of a sudden. It's not
Yeah.
just this coin, like, oh, there's
Right.
a someone on my coin, you
Yeah.
know?
She's not just abstracted
Yeah.
into this symbol of, you know, helpfulness or the way that indigenous people sort of welcomed white
Like a
Americans,
built-in
which,
subordination sort of thing.
right, exactly, which of course they responded in a number of different ways to the white people who appeared in their midst. Sometimes with violence, sometimes with diplomacy, sometimes with trade. And her story, I think, shows us all of those things.
All right, I want to ask about you before we go any further
Ooh,
here.
yes.
Yes, the first question in this little section here is, what is it about you and the West? And I don't think it's enough to
Mm,
just say, well, I'm from there. I mean,
yeah.
lots of people are from lots of places and they don't necessarily write a whole
Right.
bunch of books and become scholars.
Right.
So what is it about you in the West? What do you find either so interesting or so untapped in our scholarship about it?
Yeah. I mean, I have always been interested in what it means to be a Westerner and what it means to have a regional identity. I grew up again, like with my family going from Colorado to many other states in the Union because we took these summer vacations. And the first major one included Yellowstone, which was the first time I had been there. And we went to national parks, we went to historic sites, we went to museums, we went to amusement parks because my brother and I demanded that as the price my father would have to pay for taking us to so many historic sites. Um, but I really got a sense of the nation really early on. I was always looking at maps because, I would sit in the front seat and give my parents directions. We were kind of figuring out where we were going. And you could kind of, again, see and feel that transition zone between regions. Like you knew you were in the South when you saw different kinds of trees and you saw Spanish moss hanging off of them and you saw these large swamps, right? Like these are not landscapes you see in the American West. So that was part of it. So I've always been thinking about that. Then I came east to college. I went to Harvard, and these are some of the smartest people I've ever met. And they would find out I was from Colorado, and they would say, "Oh, did you ride your horse to school?" And then they were
Only
serious.
sometimes.
Like
Yeah.
only sometimes. Or like, do you ski every day? And I'm like, I grew up in the suburb of Denver. Like I grew up in a 1970s suburban house. Like I could see the mountains.
I
Uh
skied to school. That's how I got to
yeah,
school. Yeah.
exactly. And so it became very clear to me that many people, especially people who haven't been to the West, have very specific images of it and very
Uh,
specific beliefs about it. And so, that always interested me. And then during the pandemic, I was wondering if regional identity really mattered anymore at all,
hmm.
right?
So these are kind of
Because,
recent thoughts that have been percolating for you in some
yeah,
ways. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then, like, the recent kind of reemergence of kind of modern westerns like Yellowstone, the TV series, and why does this pioneer myth keep coming back again and again and again? Why is it so compelling? Because it is compelling. This is as a narrative and as a set of images.
So I want to ask about that. These shows, the ones that I do, are live to tape, so I do very little editing. Only if like a siren goes by or the
Hmm.
internet connection gets interrupted, something like that. Um, After you see yourself on documentaries that are highly edited and you're being interspersed with potentially a dozen other authors, how do you generally react to what the final finished product is? Do you find that your views are accurately represented and that the journalists did a good job of distilling everything?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, for the most part. And it depends on what it is. It depends on the documentary. I was recently in a 2-episode documentary on Sitting Bull that was on the History Channel. And it's been airing recently quite a lot, which is hilarious because I get these texts like, oh, you just popped up on my TV. That was weird. Like you just sort of appeared out of nowhere. And the documentary makers are, they are like authors. They are putting together a story, right? And they are using what I say and what many other people say to build a specific vision. Um, but then I've done other work for, things like History's Greatest Mysteries on the History Channel, where I'm talking about really crazy stuff like lost Confederate gold and things like that. Most of those I actually don't rewatch because
Hmm.
most of the time I can't stand to watch myself or listen to myself on any podcasts or on
I
TV.
actually know that feeling pretty well. I'm on a million things, and I
Yes.
get it. I get it.
Yeah, yeah. So I usually don't do that, but really if a documentary team, when I first talk to them about their project, if it feels sketchy at all, then I decline. Or
You
if
just
it
don't do it.
feels like, yeah, if they're trying to get me to say like weird stuff, I'm like, no, I'm
Yeah.
not going to say that. I
No,
won't do it.
yeah, I understand that. Do you find that the American West comes across better, or I guess compare and
Mm.
contrast, not necessarily better? Do you find that this story comes across better in books or on a visual medium?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Because the West's visual its visual register is so iconic. Even though there are mountain ranges in other regions, right? I mean, you have mountains in the South, not in Florida, but but in other parts of the South, and we definitely have mountains here in the Northeast. But there's something about the Rocky Mountains. There's something about, I mean, obviously deserts. If you ever see a saguaro, you know you're in Arizona because that cactus actually has a very narrow growing range. So if anyone tries to like put a saguaro in Montana, I'm like, mm-mm, no. Um, but it's so almost instantly recognizable visually, right? The
Yeah.
American West. But it's also, you can't capture, I don't think, the vastness of the American West, even on film. And I think it's equally hard to do on the page. You really have to give people a sense of the really, really immense distances between places. And this is
Yeah.
something that I
It's
also
like the Denver
think.
Broncos and the other logos of the teams.
Exactly, exactly. Like it's a huge distance, and this is something. I mean, you were asking about Western identity before, and when I was thinking about this project, I was asking public audiences across the West if they thought about themselves as Westerners, and a lot of times this was students in high school or in college, and most of them would say yes. And then I'd ask why. And they'd start off with, well, because this is where I live and my family has lived here for X generations. That's a very popular thing. Um, but then I would push them further and be like, yeah, but why? Like what is it about the West that makes you feel an affinity for the region? Or what do you think is distinctive about this place that is not present in the Midwest or the Northeast or the South? And they often said the huge distances between places that people in Montana, they'll drive 90 minutes to 2 hours to get someplace. And it's not a big deal because things are so far apart. And if you think of a state like Texas, which is just, you can drive for 12 hours and still be within the borders of the state. And I think a place like Florida is larger than people assume. If you
Yeah.
if you drive
If
from
you
the
include the
southern tip,
Keys, it's really far. Yeah.
oh yeah, it's really far.
Yeah.
But people don't really associate that with the South,
Yeah.
right? And so that grandeur, but also the danger of those huge spaces and the big and there's a reason why they call it big sky country. I mean, it really does give you a sense of capaciousness, it gives you a sense of size. The whole region is huge. Um, and it really, I think, shapes your experience. And it certainly did for the seven people in the book. I mean, they are always moving. And this is one of the arguments in the book, that this is not just an east to west narrative. that Westerners are constantly moving in all directions all the time. And even when they stop moving, even when you have someone like María Gertrudis Barceló, who ends up in Santa Fe and builds this gambling empire for herself, she is exploiting and benefiting from the movement of other people. All the people who are passing through Santa Fe, which is kind of the center of this trading network between Missouri on the Santa Fe Trail and Chihuahua City on the Chihuahua Trail, and then further south to Mexico City. You know, she's benefiting from all of that movement. And that was the case with all seven people, that even when they stopped moving, there was still movement in their lives. And these big kinship networks and trade networks and other kinds of transportation networks across thousands of miles.
What sources did you use for this? What scholarship is there? And are there archives that haven't been plumbed yet? I mean, you're looking at, I mean, the biggest possible territory almost. There could be millions of sources. So how do you narrow
Yeah.
down what to use?
Yeah, this was one of the big challenges of writing a book with such a huge scope. But really, it was the focusing on seven people that really helped me narrow it down. So each person, and we'll talk about them in a second, but each person, I chose them because there was enough stuff that I could build a sense of their lives. It was either about them or about people in their community, where I could build that story about them or about the community around them.
Were there people, I'm sorry, were there people you would have picked had there been more scholarship or no?
Well, there were so many possible people, and actually two people dropped out of the book. One was an Italian immigrant to Denver in 1875, who I had a fair amount of information about because he was going to be one of the central figures in a kind of crime book, a true crime book that I was going to write because he was a murderer. But that proposal didn't fly for a number of reasons. So I was going to integrate him into this book, but he didn't quite fit. And I didn't have enough, it's really hard to track immigrants in this country at any point because they are often not leaving a lot of documentation of their own. They do enter the census at different periods, but if they're moving through the West at times when the census takers are not there, they kind of evade that space, right? So there has to be enough written about them from other sources so that you get a sense of what's going on. And I've benefited greatly, especially with the stories of particularly the women who are harder to track. I think this is pretty standard in anything before 20th century history. Women are not leaving as many records. They're harder to track through the legal landscape. Often they're not allowed to buy property on their own, and so you can't track them with those kinds of things. But they do enter court records, and they kind of appear in interesting ways in other kinds of accounts. So Barceló and Polly Bemis, who is a Chinese immigrant, and Ella Watson, who is a Canadian, I really benefited from local historians who had gone to archives and found sources that really gave us really good details about their lives. And I also used, in terms of primary documents, a lot of newspapers. And this is where it's amazing, Colorado and Wyoming and several other states have digitized their newspapers, all the ones that they have, still existing. And so you can go to those websites and, the rendering, the digital rendering is so good now. Like it's so much better than it was even 10 years ago when I was doing research for Three Cornered. And then newspapers.com, which is tremendous, which is linked also to Ancestry.
It's almost miraculous. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And Ancestry is amazing, like people uploading all kinds of sources, and you can get census records, you could get slave schedules, you can get all kinds of primary document material. I mean, you have to be creative because often there were misspellings and, You have to know with your search terms kind of how
Hmm.
to find people who might not otherwise be found. But that those kinds of sources are amazing. But there are also there's a small library in Santa Fe called the Chavez Library, and I went there to look into their collections on Gertrudis Barceló, but I found Jim Beckwourth in them also because he shows up in Santa Fe. He was a man who was brought to St. Louis by his enslaver father and then given his free papers and ended up, part of all of these major events. And he ended up in Santa Fe during the Mexican-American War, and people talked about him. Soldiers wrote about him because he was already famous as a frontiersman. And so they were talking about how, oh, Jim Beckwourth showed up with the mail from Fort Leavenworth and all of these things. And I was really surprised to find him, but I found him in a lot of unexpected places.
It was interesting that you said that Sacajawea is the only person who most people would know by name, at least when they pick up your book. And I guess that was true for me too. I kind of felt
Hmm.
stupid when I looked at it because I'm like, geez, should I know who all these people are? I guess not.
Hmm.
Uh, let's talk about a couple of them. You mentioned Gertrudis, and I didn't know how to pronounce it till like 3 seconds ago,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
Gertrudis Barceló.
Yes.
She seems interesting.
Oh,
A bar owner,
yes.
became the wealthiest woman in Santa Fe. How did you discover her story, and in your view, what makes it illustrative
Hmm.
of the rest of the West?
Yeah, I think she is actually my favorite of the protagonists. I know we're not supposed to have favorites, Evan, but I totally have a
Well,
favorite.
who doesn't love a
And
bartender? I
it's
mean, come
her.
on.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, and she was even more than that too. I mean,
Sorry, I distilled it
I
down.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
you
sorry.
did.
Yeah,
So to speak. So to
yes.
speak. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Funny. Yeah.
Yes. She I was really interested in people again who were moving in unexpected directions. So Barcelo moves from south to north into the west. She was born in Sonora in New Spain. Her father moved the family to a town called Valencia, south of Albuquerque, in 1815, in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. This is another thing that people don't really understand is that Mexico had its own revolution against colonial powers during this period. And so they moved right in the middle of that war. And she got married in the early 1820s. And her husband taught her how to play and then to deal a card game called Spanish Monte, which is not three card Monte. It's a different game. It's got 40 cards of a Spanish deck, four suits, 10 cards each. And the game is very simple. There are five cards turned in any given hand. And in the first two turns, you can bet on what the suit will be on the fifth card. And so,
That's
yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So you
I
deal
could
two
do that.
cards and then people can bet. And then you deal another two cards and people can bet. And then you turn the fifth card. And the great thing about this game is that everyone who's playing it thinks they're going to win. But the dealer knows that pretty much all the time the house wins, right? Because even if you turn a card and someone has bet correctly, everybody else has lost. So even if you have to pay out to the one person who bet on clubs and you turned over that club card, everyone else, you take their money from them. So the house is going to win most of the time. And she was very good at it. From all the records of her and her success dealing in this game, she had a mathematical mind. She had a really good memory. She could convert currency because people were betting Mexican coins, Spanish coins,
Yeah.
American
Right.
coins, gold nuggets. It was crazy. So she could do all of that in her head. And she could also read people really well. I think they find this with a lot of card dealers. They read people really well. And she ultimately, in the 1830s, ended up in Santa Fe. She started a gambling saloon of her own, which did have a bar in it, which is very smart, right? The more whiskey someone drinks, the worse they're going to get at betting on these cards and the more money she could take from them. And she was very adept at reading kind of the power differentials in Santa Fe. And when Stephen Watts Kearny showed up with his Army of the West in 1846 to take New Mexico as part of the Mexican-American War, she knew exactly what was going to happen. She knew that the Americans were going to be there for a while. And so the first thing she did, the first day they were there, they got an invitation from her to come to dinner. The officers did to come to dinner at her house and then to gamble in her in
Uh,
her saloon. And they were, soldiers are the best customers in that scenario, right? They have
right.
money and they have a lot of time. And so,
And they
yeah,
need to
so
take a load
she
off.
exactly.
Uh,
So she's representing to me the way that borders are moving around people, even as people are moving across borders.
I want to ask about Polly Bemis. She
Yes.
seems like a very modern story.
Yes.
Chinese woman trafficked to Idaho, built
Yep.
a life for herself despite anti-immigrant laws and also
Hmm.
built-in prejudice. How did you discover her story?
I had actually known about her for quite some time because back in the day, in a former life, in the late 20th century, Evan, I was an English teacher. I was a high school English teacher. And then when I went to graduate school, I taught English courses. I taught as part of my American Studies program. And I taught regional literature. And one of the books that I taught was called 1000 Pieces of Gold. Um, and it was about Polly Bemis. It was a novel of her life in the West. And so I, for a very long time, had thought about this as a Western story, but did not know that that novel, it was based on some facts, but not all of them. And much of it was fictionalized. And so when I thought about someone moving from west to east into the West and how Polly Bemis would allow me to tell the story of Chinese migration, which actually began with the gold rush, the California gold rush in 1849. And then the Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific Railroad, which is part of the Transcontinental Project. And then they end up in a lot of the mining towns across the West. And many of these mining towns, like the one in which Polly Bemis lived for all of her life in America, Warren, Idaho, was majority Chinese. And that's just not something Americans think about, right? Because that story has really been erased from our general narrative of gold rush towns. Usually there's maybe one or two Chinese people in a depiction of the West in this way. Usually they own a laundry or some kind of restaurant, but not a town that is dominated by Chinese miners and other residents. So, she comes to Idaho. We lose track of her for about 10 years. And then she reappears in census records. And we know a lot about her. And I benefited a lot from a local historian, again, who went and dug into local sources and found this remarkable diary of a rancher who lived across the Salmon River from Polly Bemis and her husband, Charlie, for years and years and years, 20 to 30 years near the end of her life. And he kept a daily diary and he talked about her all the time. So we knew what she did on a daily basis for years after historians usually lose interest in her. Which is in the 1890s. But her story, I think, is really remarkable, and I think she allowed me to talk about immigration restriction and this kind of tightening vise in the late 19th century, where the federal government is really trying to control and surveil non-white Westerners, particularly Asian immigrants and also indigenous peoples.
We're running just a hair short on time here, and it's just my
Oh,
fault. I've written so
oh.
many questions. If you want to hear about the other four, three or four, you may have to read the book. You will have to read the book.
Yes,
Um,
please do.
yeah, please do read it and buy it. Couple wrap up questions here. How would America, do you think, be different if we understood the
Mm.
West better?
I think that if we truly embraced, if all Americans embraced the reality of the West, which was full of diverse communities moving in and out, that one of our central narratives would be about not just, the rugged individualism of white men mostly moving through the landscape and the sort of cowboy as the great American hero, but about the true kind of diversity and the polyglot nature of both the West and I think all regions in the United States, and that we would value that more. I mean, I think a lot of lip service is paid, to the melting pot of America and all this kind of stuff. But really, what we're seeing, and this is why it's particularly important today, we are seeing a kind of revamping of a lot of the immigration restriction and deportation actions and street violence that Polly Bemis's community experienced, that Indigenous people experienced in the late 19th century. And this is the cost of erasing people from a national narrative, because if you are producing images and you're writing, pieces about the West that deliberately erase many of the groups that actually live there, many of the people who actually kind of built that region, what you're doing is you're framing them as un-American or non-American, right? They are depicted literally as aliens. And when you do that, it makes it very easy to take people's rights away.
We've had authors who have wrestled with just this question on this show. I want to ask, is America too big to govern properly?
Yeah, I mean this was always the founders' concerns, right? I mean, if the country grew to such an extent that people lost touch with one another, would this create a crisis of nationalism? And I think it has. I mean, I think this is
Even though we have technology, even though we can talk to
right.
each other and watch live cams from anywhere in the world.
I mean, well, and this is what's really interesting to me about the founding myths of American identity, and what is it that brings us together? What is it that makes us feel, all of us feel like Americans, right? I mean, we just had the Olympics. That's one thing, right? And often in the wake of an attack of some kind, right? So things in which we are pitted against outsiders,
Mm. Mm.
usually, or rivals or enemies. These are usually the things that create a kind of collective consciousness and a national identity. And unfortunately, a lot of that kind of urge has been directed not against, I mean, it's not, I don't mean to say we should direct it against people outside of
Yeah.
our borders, but inside our borders as well. And that the centers of power, usually in the East Coast, have depicted a lot of communities in the West and other regions as outsiders.
I'm sure that you've watched Breaking Bad. My
Yes.
favorite shot in the whole thing is when he's standing at the or is it him? I forget who's standing there, but they show the Four Corners Monument and they zoom
Mm,
in and they start really tight and zoom all the way out and they show the big cross where the states meet.
hmm.
I'm curious, what are your, and I've never been there. I'd love to go there. What are your favorite places
Oh,
that
yeah.
define the West? And I'll just throw a couple out. The Four Corners Monument, Yellowstone, Vegas defines the West in some
Mm,
ways, even though it's not
hmm.
natural, or at least that part
Hmm.
of it. The Strip is not natural. The St. Louis Arch, the Grand Canyon, the Hoover
Hmm.
Dam, the Space Needle, that's West.
Oh, hmm.
What are your what place do you think defines it?
Oh, wow. That is such a good question. And, most of the places that you mentioned are preserved as national parks or national historic sites, which I think is important because I think then that those places have been recognized collectively as important, which is really interesting. Um, I would say that the Colorado River and the Rio Grande,
Ah,
water is such an essential resource in the West, and there are lots of fights about it. There continue to be. Riparian rights are crazy. If you're ever a lawyer and you're an environmental lawyer dealing with riparian rights, it's absolutely insane. Because who owns water, right? And rivers are often borders. They are often barriers to be kind of crossed in whatever way you can, either submerged or on some sort of bridge. And I am I am obsessed with transportation networks anyway. Like, as a landscape historian, I don't consider myself only interested in nature, but in man-made environments also. And so I love roads. I love a road or a trail of any kind. But I also love rivers because they're so interesting because they're kinetic. They're constantly moving. So a river is never the same from one second to the next. But they're absolutely essential in the West. And those, to me, I think the major rivers of the West really define it.
Your dedication to my fellow Westerners, especially those who never thought these histories belonged to them.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you say that? What did you mean by that?
So pretty early on, when I was asking people whether they thought of themselves as Westerners, I asked friends of ours, and he is white from Colorado. She is biracial. Her father is Black, her mother is white. She's from St. Louis. And they have lived together in California and Colorado most of their lives. And so I asked them when we were at dinner, and I said, do you consider yourself a Westerner? And he said yes. And she said no. And I said, well, why not? I asked her why not. And she said, because I never felt like that identity belonged to me.
Well, now you've got a book. Now she's got a book.
I know, exactly. So the book is in part to kind of offer up a story and a reality so that many Americans can see themselves in this place, and so that they know that this history belongs to all of them.
Do you know what you're going to do next?
I do.
Would you like to tell me? Are you allowed?
I am. I actually just signed the contract.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes, thank you. The next book will be, I'm going back to the Civil War, but I'm staying in the West. And it will be the story of an 1864 Kiowa Comanche raid on a biracial ranching community in North Texas.
Cool.
Yeah. And what it tells us about Texas, what it tells us about this part of the West in this moment, and the importance of the West in the Civil War. So it will be, very closely related to Three Cornered, but involve some different communities. And
what year did it happen in?
1864.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Doctor, you are now tied for the record of appearances on this show.
Woohoo!
3. Kate Anderson Brower, my great friend, it was on the first episode. She's been on 3 times. And now Lindsay Travinsky is the other 3-time guest. So we both know
bestie.
her.
That's
your
right.
bestie. Mm-hmm. And now you've been here 3 times. So now it's a race between the 3 of you to see who can get to 4.
We're going to throw down. We're throwing down. I know Lindsay's she's working on a new book on John Quincy Adams. So she's much farther ahead in her process than I am. So you'll probably have her on for 4 times.
Better start writing fast.
I know.
Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, the author of The Westerners, Mythmaking and Belonging on the American Frontier. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Check out the book and also her website, MeganKateNelson.com. She's on Instagram at Megan Kate Nelson. AxelBankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page. Check out Nikki's work. I also want to invite listeners to go to that Patreon to keep the show going and also to help children's literacy. It's patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. Portions of every donation and every contribution go to help children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.